Hi, this is John Firth with the 11th in our summer or what we call spring series of LinkedIn Lives. I'm here with my friend Mark Moore, and we're going to take an interesting way of looking at leadership from a different direction. As a coach, I work primarily with business owners and some CEOs, and inevitably I always run up against the issue of how do you create the burning platform around certain business principles that are what I call the physics of business, that they're immovable, they are the truth, and yet some people don't see it. And we then do something we call reframing. We take it out of the usual context and we take it somewhere else using different words, different concepts. You apply get their experiences going, and ways of reframing the question. So when I started working with something called the Flow Group, a bunch of agile consultants and coaches, a group that Mark is part of, I began to hear a story. And the story I heard was that what makes for a good software development project, really any standalone project, are certain principles. And we're going to go through them because if you look at it through the eyes of a CEO or an entrepreneur, you would say, well, this is obviously the same principles they should be following. So my hope is when I do reframe something, they suddenly get something that their brain wasn't willing to accept. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect is that many entrepreneurs and CEOs aren't really techies and are not comfortable with technology. And yet everybody knows that technology, you have to have at least a comfort or have people who know what they're doing. And a lot of things get lost in translation. And I see often with business, especially sort of younger, not necessarily younger, but people who are still in startup mode, that when it comes time to develop a software product or their own IT systems, they suddenly are looking down the cannon going, oh my God, I'm going to die. This is not going to work. And they start freaking themselves out. This is a chance for people who are CEOs of that sort to be able to realize it doesn't matter. When an agile project is done properly, the language and the approach and the various principles should be second nature to a CEO. And if the CEO sticks to those, there should be absolutely no problem and be able to lower their anxiety and be more productive as CEOs. So I'd like Mark to introduce himself. As usual, we welcome any comments or questions. And we should probably spend about 7 or 8 minutes on each of 4 topics. So we'll be finished by 40 after the hour, I believe. So Mark, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, John. Welcome. It's great to be here. So I'm Mark Moore. I'm a independent consultant out of the Raleigh, North Carolina area. I've spent about 40 years in various industries and technology roles, primarily been in program and project management. I've also developed, along with that group that John mentioned, a consulting practice to help companies and programs and projects adopt and adapt to more agile and innovative ways of working so that we clearly identify and drive out the value that these projects and initiatives deliver and make sure that they align with the overall organization vision and purpose, and the counterpart, be able to weed out the things that we shouldn't be doing quickly and not end up investing too much time in something that won't end up bringing about the kind of results that the business needs, especially in today's challenged world.
Right. And we're talking about not only products that a company might sell on the market, but also internal software development.
Absolutely.
Or any project internally. So the principles that guide agility is what we're going to be talking about. And I think if you're a CEO, you're going to recognize that these are exactly the principles that CEOs should be drawing on to be effective leaders, and vice versa. So let's go to the first one, and Mark actually alluded to it, which is technology projects only deliver value when they are aligned with an organization's needs. Now, you can say that a whole bunch of for a bunch of things, but why is that so important? And why are we talking about the needs or the vision of an organization and not, say, a vision for the whole company? Where's the difference there?
I view them as somewhat similar, However, that overarching vision, which we will talk about, you mentioned flow. We're actually in the process of rebranding that to guerrilla leadership, which is something that is put in place to talk about the asymmetric nature of the world today and the fast pace of change. Mm-hmm. But that overarching vision that we can hang everything off of and cascade that down means that everything we deliver, as you said, an internal initiative or project, an external product, and this works for software, for non-software, everything has to contribute to value. And if you can ensure that up front, you'll first avoid doing the wrong things, you'll invest in doing the right things, and you'll put yourself on a better path to succeed on those right things that contribute the value you need to continue to grow the organization and ensure you fulfill the overall vision.
And in the world of leadership or organizational leadership, business leadership, that can be a fairly soft discussion, meaning it's very hard to put facts behind this. So what do you do to ensure that a project or a series of projects align with the organization, the vision for the organization, the business? Is there some concrete methodology you use?
Yeah, definitely. The first things you do are you go in and do some kind of lightweight, simple surveys of the teams to make certain they actually understand what the vision is. And you do that at all levels of the organization and compare to see how close do you come to everybody being aligned on what that vision is. And if there's a lot of misalignment, the first thing you do is go back and work on that. And as you had mentioned, leadership, the most senior leadership in an organization, really needs to cast and constantly reinforce and support that vision so that others will understand it and be able to articulate the value they're delivering and clearly slot that in against the vision. And when it doesn't align and it doesn't contribute, then you're at a point where you can talk about it and make decisions to pivot. So the first thing you would do would be exercises to really drive out what is that vision and does everybody clearly understand it. The best companies in the world do that, and they look at it on a regular basis, and they look at it all the way down to the lowest individual level to make certain those folks truly understand it and can articulate it back.
Yeah. And what's interesting about this discussion as a general sort of catch-all for it is software development projects, you can't see software. However, you can see what software does. It's in some cases much more tangible than some of the other aspects of forming an organization, which is sometimes hard to put your finger on. You know, what's not working? Is it aligned with the vision? I remember my time when I was head of international strategy for Discovery, and there were certain products, and I say literally products, they were considering bringing out to the market, and we would say that's not aligned with our brand. That's not what we were about. But then you have 1,000 different opinions about what that was or what it should have been, or should this particular product have been brought out. But this is sort of tangible. The software, my experience with software projects in particular, is they can go off the rails really quickly. It's like if you don't take these principles seriously and have a way to deal with them, you're going to see much more disastrous results than if you not quite get it the way with the CEO. So again, CEOs have to understand how rigorous it has to be for a software project, but also reverse can say the rigor with which they make sure everything aligns with a vision and a mission statement, that they have. A lot of them don't take it that seriously, quite honestly. Some of them really don't even want to deal with this because they think it's too soft. But in a software development project, you don't have a choice if you're going to be agile. Correct?
Yeah, you really don't. And as a matter of fact, we can take lessons from projects outside of software development and easily apply them. One of the classic ones that I use frequently is refer people back to the planning and construction of the Empire State Building. Mm-hmm. And the overarching vision and the value proposition was they had to get done before May of a specific year, because that's when all the leases rolled in New York City.
Right.
And if they weren't ready for occupancy, they were gonna boot an entire year's worth of revenue, and they lose it. So that's the kind of thing where we say you connect even the lowest level activities with that overall vision and make sure it's always aligned so that you deliver the value on the timeline that you need it to be successful.
And you have hit on something that we actually haven't really called out in the agenda, which is when you say agile, what does that mean? Well, it actually means you can do sprints, that you can chop the salami in certain place, up in such a way that you can try something, see if it works, try it again, do sprints. And that is one aspect, that's a technique to make sure that you're aligned, because you will find out very quickly that if you're aligned or not. And if you think about the CEO's world, there are many things they do that they really should chop the salami very thin to make sure that, first of all, the things are differentiated. Second of all, so you can test whatever it is you're testing, see if it works or not. But it goes down to even meetings. How do you slice the salami in a meeting so you get the most value? And you do meetings only for an hour every now and then. So you've got a bunch of salami, very much an agile principle.
Absolutely. I mean, another word that will, as a matter of fact, I end up preferring to do this is in an iterative fashion so that you really understand the priorities and focus on them. And that's the kind of discussion I know we're going to have today as you start to lay that out. But it really does begin with what's the end value I'm going to deliver, and does that align with and support the overarching vision that will drive the business forward?
Exactly. So you mentioned our next topic, which is one of the sort of four basic overarching principles, which is you need to set priorities. You need to prioritize, but you need to be always doing that because things change. You have to have the mindset of constantly reshifting based on a whole bunch of factors. So tell us more about that in the context of software or projects in general.
And this is critical, and this is where what you hear termed quote unquote waterfall out in the major marketplace versus agile, which is generally a smoke screen. You've got to drive through that and clear that away. The idea is I need to know what the next thing or things I'm going to do are. You'll hear the agile folks talk about backlog. Well, this is in the backlog. This is in the backlog. This is in the current sprint backlog, meaning we're supposed to be working on it. But unless you ask the question, is it the right thing to do? Are these the right series of things because of what they will either deliver in and of themselves, or the building block, the foundational building block they will provide? Go back to the Empire State Building. They had to get the superstructure up, and they had to get it skinned so that in the off season, in the off weather, they could work on the interior without facing the elements. They had to do things in 2-floor increments because they had a 2-square block radius, and they couldn't have a whole lot of material laying around. They chose to stagger suppliers so that they made good use of their supply chain. And remember, this was in the 1930s. This was stuff that was unheard of in the construction industry. It's very similar to that. It's lining up the work, lining up the effort, lining up the deliverables so that they build upon one another, and ultimately they provide that value that aligns to your vision. And you do have to constantly reevaluate and say, are we doing the right thing? Are we doing it the right way? Is it having the right results? Are we moving towards that value delivery aligned to vision?
And again, somehow in software development projects or in projects in general, because they're so defined up front, so well defined, almost in terms of every single action item, you can, I find it easier but more important to set priorities. Well, no, I should say, or actually what I want to say is there's an art to setting priorities. I had a meeting with a client yesterday and his team, and what was really an issue was planning. Very little planning. So software development projects demands to have the planning done up front, but it doesn't mean it's cast in stone. And there's an art, there's a mindset, there's a technique for a CEO or a leader to understand what really is the priority. Even if they want to do something else, which I've got clients who've like, I want to do it this way. I want to have all these bells and whistles before I issue a new software product to the marketplace. No, you want to have the minimum functionality, because the longer you wait to put all these bells and whistles, the chances are you might miss the opportunity. And I think that goes for everything, that a CEO has to constantly be planning, looking ahead, and then setting the priorities based, first of all, on his abilities, but also, or her abilities, their abilities, their the business, the marketplace, and so forth. But in software product development projects, you really feel the problem if you're not, you really see it firsthand if you're not setting the priorities. In business, you might, leading a business, they may get hidden by other sorts of agendas, but it always comes back to the same thing: planning, prioritizing. Otherwise, you've got a workforce that'll probably burn out, quite honestly.
Yeah, and it's a classic planning horizon, John.
Mm-hmm.
When I would teach this type of adaptive planning in
Mm-hmm.
courses I've developed and taught in the past,
Mm-hmm.
I would talk about, well, we're going to go on a 2-month vacation this summer, and we're going to circumnavigate the United States. And we know that we want to go generally south and then west and then north and then back east. And we know we want to hit some major hot spots at some point in time. And those become big buckets with names on them, but you don't put all the details into that bucket in many cases until it becomes much closer in on the planning horizon. That's what you're trying to do. And you're trying to very quickly understand what's coming up in the next immediate cycle or two that really is the most important. And that's where, under Flow Guerrilla Leadership, we'll talk about distilling things down and driving and choosing to do the next right thing or things that will build towards that value delivery.
Yeah, and I've discovered there are a couple of constraints that drive prioritization. When I think about a strategy, which is where I come from, you always talked about the low-hanging fruit, get that banged out quickly if it's a new business or if it's a turnaround. Just look for the low-hanging fruit. That means that which goes quickly and cheaply and can make a big effect. Then you look for those things where they're not so costly still, but they'll still make a big, or they're going to cost something. They're not, low cost. They're going to cost something, and they're going to have, however, a very big impact. Then you look at the things that are going to be quite costly, might take a lot of time, and are maybe not as important. You're constantly prioritizing based on cost, time, and importance, impact. Those are the three factors that are always what your CEO is always juggling to make decisions about what to prioritize.
And what you're talking about here is you're talking about, instead of fighting the constraints, you're managing the work to the constraints. Go back to my Empire State Building example. There were some very specific constraints: that May 1st deadline, the need to enclose the building, the fact that the builders said, we don't want to keep switching floors with elevators. We want a single shaft that goes all the way up. Those were constraints that the architects and builders said, okay, rather than fight those, we're going to accept those, and we're going to build and schedule around those. So they knew what they needed to do, and they had an idea of the sequence, and then they were able to very much focus on the next couple of things and see progress toward it. And that's why they built that building as quickly as they did.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of it is speed, getting in at the lowest cost, at the fastest speed, and make the maximum impact you can. The other constraint, I think, is in some industries is regulation, the government's relationship to it now. They're only now, I think, in Washington beginning to understand technology, period. But yeah, you have external factors that are going to make you have to shift your priorities sometimes, where you have no control over it. People leaving, for example.
And that, those regulatory constraints come at all sorts of levels. Construction, you have to have a final occupancy permit. The pharmaceutical development industry. There's
Right.
some pretty steep regulations
Oh,
that
boy,
get
big
you
time.
to done and marketable. And I worked for one of the drug testing companies
Uh-huh.
in my career, so I got some exposure to that.
Yeah.
And you can only do so much to bend those constraints. More than likely, you have to work within them.
And if you don't understand them well and the impact they can have, given what options you have, you can kill a project instantly. You can kill a company instantly.
Yep.
So let's move on to the next one. This one's my personal favorite. Don't let anyone hide behind tech speak. Now you have this dynamic where, let's just say the CEO is not a techie per se and gets freaked out when his techies start going in certain directions where they can't speak English. They can speak tech speak. And then the CEO just gets flummoxed and his anxiety or her anxiety raises to extraordinary levels. Meanwhile, the tech people go back to their teams and say, I told you this guy's stupid. He didn't get me. And what's really happening is people are hiding, people doing the project. If they have to hide because things aren't happening right, or they're afraid, or they're just not good, the techno speak starts. And this is true of anything. It's not just technology. You have a bunch of specialists who are running your company, specialists in sales and marketing, specialists in finance, and so forth. They can easily get lost in the technical aspects of what they do. So tell us a little bit about how this happens in a software development project or any project.
And it happens a lot. You'll start to hear buzzwords and pet words and what I call vanity metrics thrown out. And some of this has become almost indigenous to working agile, and they'll talk about scrums and they'll talk about story points. The end of the day, the CEO, the leaders really need to put themselves in a position where they can calmly but authoritatively cut through all that fog. And they need to help enable their tech leadership and their tech doers to be put in a place where, first off, they understand that business value that they're delivering in any project.
Right.
What does this mean? Why did we choose to do this? Why was this prioritized over anything else?
Right.
And you just have to slog through the sometimes difficult practice of getting to that common, simple language that says, okay, let's not talk in these vanity metrics of, well, we completed this many story points. No, let's talk about what you delivered that tangibly showed value, either directly or as a building block to what's coming next. Get out of the tunnel vision and help everybody see the bigger picture. This is the why we're doing this. And as we had said before, the clear priorities. Don't focus on too much, because that does cause people to go run and hide. Because, well, I'm so busy. Well, let's peel back here and understand the why am I doing this, and get to the most essential elements so that we can have these commonalities, this common language. And frankly, that's one of the things that I've been very successful at over my career, and help bridge the gap between the technical and the executive leadership to say, no, this is what's happening. This is what we're seeing. These are the hurdles we're seeing. This is why you do or don't want to do this, all tied back to that vision value stream.
Right. And it's interesting because, again, a conversation I had yesterday was very similar to that. There was a technologist on the call, the CTO on the call, and he was really having trouble expressing himself, but he was making the effort to not hide behind the techno speak. And his challenge is how do you talk to a bunch of people in his leadership team and the CEO who don't intrinsically understand what you're doing? And he says we determined he has to spend even more time explaining in simple language why a particular feature that they deem is important will require an immense amount of money and be very difficult, as opposed to an equally impactful feature that you can just plug and play. Now, for a non-techie, that's almost impossible to understand why there's a difference. But if the technical lead can actually sit down and explain in very simple terms, in terms of this feature, let me just explain to you how long it's going to take and why it takes so long in simple language. Because otherwise you run into this incredible, Tower of Babel. You got the non-techies, the business people insisting on meeting business needs, and you got a bunch of technical people, as you pointed out, who may be getting a little flummoxed and a little annoyed by all that because they haven't learned how to talk to a CEO. And the last thing I would say is, when I was a strategy consultant and I was working exclusively with CEOs and their leadership teams, one of the things I learned and often used as a phrase for new consultants was, pretend you're talking to a 3-year-old when you're trying to explain this concept. The CEOs have so much swirling over their head. And if you could come to something new or out of their realm of understanding, again, you reframe it, just make sure a 3-year-old can understand.
Yeah. If I can't explain it simply like that, I don't understand it well enough myself.
Yes, exactly.
To really make it happen.
Yeah,
so
it's like what Mark Twain
really
said,
Yeah, and I have seen signs through my career of the tech teams hiding. One, I can distinctly say we were coming up with some sort of a dashboard to be able to represent. He says, well, you can't measure us that way because we're agile, we're iterative. Well, what he was saying is, I've got a do not disturb sign up here. And he didn't want to engage and say, okay, here's how we can actually measure progress, see where we're adapting and changing. You have to be able to do that. And part of that is that vision cast and support that connects value all the way along the line. And you also can't be afraid to say, maybe we shouldn't be doing this right now. Maybe we shouldn't be doing it at all, but maybe we shouldn't be doing it right now. Just like the CTO friend you mentioned said, this really won't bring the value you want, and here's why. But we can do this for about the same amount of effort, and it will bring value.
Our technical people, when do they learn that? And not all of them do. And how do they learn that?
Not all of them do. As a matter of fact, quite often it's rare that some of them do, because it's easy for them to go hide behind this. You'll hear a lot about people putting in OKRs and KPIs, and then they end up being weaponized against tech teams. So they'll make stuff up. Years and years ago, I read a great article on earned value management, where one of the people quoted it, said, my project's green. It'll be green until the moment they walk me out the door, because projects are always green here, despite the fact that the evidence indicates they're blood beating, blinking red.
Right. Yeah. No, it's very interesting, because it's not also just hiding. It's hiding is a form of lying, and you lie usually to avoid embarrassment or to lose your status and so forth. But it's also, some just don't understand the value, the importance. It gets a little arrogant from a viewpoint of a CEO. It can very quickly appear as if the CTO is either unfocused and lying, i.e., why did that take you 4 weeks to do this? I thought it's a simple feature if it hasn't been explained to him. But it's also, there's some arrogance with technical people. Is we're smarter than you. And if you can't understand that, that's your problem, not our problem. So there is a mindset thing. Good. We're coming towards the end of the program. Again, I just want to say I'm sitting here with Mark Moore in terms of talking about the lessons that can be learned, first of all, by technology people when doing projects, so that it better aligns with the CEO's intentions, needs, and vision, and vice versa, that a CEO can learn from the process of agile development things that are really germane to leadership, and that are so clear in a software project when something goes wrong, but not always so clear when you're in the broader organizational context and the portfolio of businesses you may or may not have as a business leader. So here's my second favorite point, which is tools are just tools. So tell us a little bit about that, Mark. And this is the final one, by the way.
And I could cite you chapter and verse of organizations I've worked for and with who have made the tool the thing, and it ends up taking on a life of its own.
Mm-hmm.
I would one of the big ones in software a decade or so ago was, well, we need to do automated testing. I say that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Have you sought out and begun to hire your zookeeper? Say, what?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you are going to run a complex zoo like automated testing, you better have a very trained, skilled, and proficient zookeeper to run it. Someone who knows the tool, someone who can easily translate this, because you'll find if you can't test it manually, automating it just produces more garbage and at a higher cost.
Oh, yeah.
And you get a similar thing. Well, we need a portfolio management. We need a PMO. Really, when somebody comes to me and says, I've been chartered with setting up a PMO, what should I do first? What tool should I do? I said, well, the first thing you should do is ask what C-level executive is directly and consistently sponsoring this. Because if the answer is there isn't one, the first thing you should do is go update your resume, because the average lifespan of a PMO in IT America is like 3 to 4 years max.
Yeah.
And you're being set up for a fall, whether anybody knows it or wants to admit it or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tools, tools are just really, really challenging things if you don't treat them as tools. They end up complicating things rather than helping you clarify priorities. And as I said, then they take on a life of its own, and you find out you end up working for the tool rather than it working for you.
Right. It's a little bit the fetishing of tools, sort of tool porn, if you will, that you fall so in love with the tool for a variety of reasons. One is because it's a great way to show off if you understand the tool. But it's like companies that fall in love with their products. It makes you almost impossible to be agile. If your tools take on a life of their own, then it's very hard to throw a tool away when it's no longer working, because people are so committed to
you invest a lot in it. As a matter of fact, one of the biggest branded tools in the agile world out there right now is SAFe. Capital S, capital A, capital F, low E, SAFe, in its version 6, where they finally began to address the need for leadership gaps. But the SAFe training is wickedly expensive to start with, and then they want like $1,000 a head per year to recertify you. So the tool becomes an all-encompassing be-all, and no, I got to keep the tool, I got to keep my certification up to date. Well, if you haven't been able to, if you can't sit in a conference room with a whiteboard or a brown paper and draw out your process, your tool's not going to help you.
Right. And if you focus on only the tool, so I'm glad you use sort of the whiteboard concept or so forth, which is if you obsess around the whiteboard as the main focus, you're missing all the content. You're missing all the stuff that makes it valuable. It is just a tool. It's like, the discussion about cell phones. Are they a rich pipe or a dumb pipe? It doesn't really matter, because it's going to be dumb anyhow. Don't focus on, and a lot of people do fetishize cell phones. But it really is just a device to deliver what's important, which is content. And I think that's something that CEOs often forget. Is they'll focus on something, usually because it's a safe harbor, something they know well, and they'll forget the bigger picture, which kind of brings us right back to the beginning, which is about prioritizing. It is a form of prioritizing. If you fall in love with your tool or it becomes the focus, you have stopped prioritizing. You have stopped looking at the alignment with your vision and your mission statement. Right,
and you'll end up with a zoo that you got to have a zookeeper and a bunch of attendants to care for and feed.
Good analogy. Well, thank you again, Mark. I think in summary, I would say that the core principles that I see is prioritization. That's very hard for CEOs, and it's very hard and it's important in technology projects for the CEO to understand it. But beyond just projects, prioritization is probably one of the most important CEO abilities. And you're prioritizing everything. You're prioritizing investment. You're prioritizing for promotion, always. I mean, that is probably one of the single most important roles of a CEO.
Yeah, and it will help cut through the fog more than anything else out there.
Yeah, and well, we'll go into examples of when they don't do it, but you can imagine what happens if you're not good at that. Cost overruns, cash flow issues, wrong people in the wrong seats, and so forth. The other thing I would say is that you really have to be sure that people are aligned in general, aligned on the vision, aligned on the mission, but also aligned on the speech, the words they use. A lot of projects that I've done that weren't technology, but strategy or change management, you spend a lot of time up front clarifying what the terms mean. Mergers and acquisitions, the post-merger integration, huge part of it is making sure that the organizations are speaking the same language.
Right.
So those, and that's in general language. I think people underestimate how important language is and what it can or cannot do. So those are my key takeaways. Yeah. What about your key takeaways from our discussion?
I very much aligned with what you're saying. I think the biggest thing CEOs and most senior leadership can do is make sure they have that rock solid vision, that they're communicating that the feedback loop is continuous and goes all the way down to the lowest level. In Flow Guerrilla Leadership, we'll talk about 4 lenses, and it does go all the way down to the individual, but it has to come back as well to make certain everybody understands.
Right, exactly. Well, great. It was wonderful. I look forward to hearing or engaging with you again on, I think it's May 17th when you're going to talk to my Vistage group.
Yep.
About this concept.
I see we do have one question that got put in the chat.
Sorry, I didn't look at it.
Yeah, Patrice, he wants to know about a point of entry. I'll give a typical consultant's answer here, Patrice. It really depends. It depends upon the situation that you're going into. It's not an easy thing to break into. I've kind of evolved and developed into this based on the relationships that I've built, and not only my success, but being able to leverage other people's success as well. But we do have some foundational things, many of which we presented today, that can be critical in being a successful coach. And it's not just about being an agile coach. It's about being maybe what we might call a value coach, where the value always supports the vision.
Yeah, no, and that was one of the first things I realized, is that sitting in on the agile meetings with you guys, Flow, it was like just coming back to me again. That is the main points that as a coach I need to reinforce, find ways for them to understand prioritization and alignment and so forth. And as I said at the beginning, the act of reframing it using this context might be the difference between somebody getting it and somebody not getting it, because everything else, they just doesn't capture it for them and they don't get it. So I think in some ways this has provided me with more tools as a coach.
Good.
Excellent.
That's the intent.
Thank you, Mark, again. And we have our last LinkedIn Live next Thursday for this first half of the year. And that's going to be on ageism. So something a little bit different, but we'll be having the same conversation, or I'll have the same conversation with 2 experts in the area, Alan Byrne and Joanne Thomas. So I look forward to seeing everybody then.
Yep. Thank you, John. Thank you for having me.